Can women be pastors? What is the role of women? Here at God Theories, we explore different theologies of the Christian faith, and you can make up your own mind. This video will explain the theology behind the progressive view. Let's start with the passages in the Bible that create the most controversy. The passages include those in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy. Let's start with 1 Corinthians 11 verses 3 through 16. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. Conservative theology interprets many of these verses as transcultural. Transcultural means that the principles are timeless and therefore are relevant today as they were written in those passages. Does that mean conservative Christians believe that women still need to cover their heads? We just read verses in the Bible that say that. No. Culture-bound, on the other hand, means that the author of those passages was addressing the situation at that time, and that the passages need to be understood in context. Let's look at these verses again, but highlight in green what conservative theology interprets as transcultural or still relevant today. Now let's highlight in red what conservative theology interprets as culture, bound or no longer relevant. Progressive Christians would say that conservative Christians are cherry-picking, which verses should be considered transcultural and which should be culture-bound. Let's look at a couple more passages before we explain the progressive view. In 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 to 35, it says, "Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church." And in 1 Timothy 2 verses 9 to 15, it says, "I also want the women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety." Again, let's highlight in green what conservative Christians would consider transcultural or relevant today. Let's now highlight in red what conservative Christians would consider culture-bound or no longer relevant. Conservative Christians are relying on only those green verses to explain why women should not be pastors even today. But all those verses in red, well, they say those don't apply to us. What was the context in which Paul wrote 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy? In those passages, Paul was addressing the churches of Corinth and Ephesus respectively. It is important to understand why Paul wrote what he did. Most theologians believe Paul wrote 1 Corinthians in approximately 55 AD. Corinth was a major cosmopolitan city, and many considered it the most important city in Achaia. The congregation of the church in Corinth was mostly made up of Gentiles. Going back to 1 Corinthians 11:3, Paul was establishing the order of beings on earth. The verses do not denote superiority. In the exact same sentence that Paul says, "The head of woman is man," he also says, "The head of Christ is God." If Paul meant men are superior to women, that would imply that he also meant God is superior to Christ, but Paul understood God and Christ were equal as part of the Trinity. Most conservative Christians acknowledge that the writings of head coverings are culture-bound. In Corinth at that time, women with short hair were labeled as prostitutes. The fact that so much of 1 Corinthians 11 is culture-bound should send strong signals that the intentions were to teach about the broader message of authority. In 1 Corinthians 14:34, Paul uses the word submission not to denote inferiority, but to denote the gender roles in Corinthian culture during that time. In Corinthian culture, women were not allowed to confront men in public. Because of the new freedom women felt from the Christian doctrines emphasizing equality, Paul wanted to remind them that they still needed to adhere to the cultural norms of their time. While these gender roles are misogynistic by today's standards, in the Corinthian culture at that time, women were expected to cook and clean, while only men received formal education. Paul still believed in the equality of all men and women, but believed that their roles could be complementary. Arguably, Paul believed that Corinthian women must be in submission to men in spiritual teachings, the same way men must be in submission to women for domestic chores. Paul's broader message was for people to not use Christianity as an excuse to do anything one pleases. Even conservative Christians today will agree that women need not ask their own husbands at home in order to learn. It is inconsistent, therefore, to believe the preceding sentence is transcultural. What about 1 Timothy? Many scholars believe 1 Timothy was written in approximately 64 AD after Paul sent Timothy to the church in Ephesus to counter false teachings there. The church in Ephesus was similar to the church in Corinth, whereby Paul was granting women even more liberties than the cultural norms of those times. Women were not allowed to study in Ephesus, but Paul was saying it was okay to do so as long as they did not abuse their rights and blame their insubordination on Christianity. If anything, Christian doctrine was more liberating for women during those times. Both Corinthian and Ephesian cultures were extremely misogynistic, but Christianity highlighted that God viewed both men and women as equal. Paul wanted to restore order and make sure that women did not use their faith as an excuse to do whatever they pleased. Make sure to subscribe to God Theories to hear both progressive and conservative explanations of the Christian faith.